Hello YouTube. This video will cover Exalted Blade and the arcane Melee Afflictions and all of the features that you get when you use Melee Afflictions that you don't get on an influence build. And I think after showing a lot of the little features and tips and tricks that you get with this, it'll be pretty obvious on why why I've been recommending and why I would recommend pretty much every Excalibur build should just run it. Even if you just sort of lightly use Excalibur, even if it's just one of those things that pops up in Steel Pass Circuit or within your EDA, ETA as an option, why this is what I would recommend running. And this isn't going to include a specific Subsume, but I will cover one that I think probably holistically as Excalibur melee kit in general just benefits it the most. And there's a few reasons for that we'll cover. But I think the easiest way to get into this is to start showing Exalted Blade and discussing how Melee Afflictions works. So, from the context of an Exalted Blade or some sort of exalted weapon, whenever an enemy has a status effect on them and they're able to be knocked down or flung, and you then subsequently knock down or fling them, you will take whatever status effects are on that target and add 6 to them. Now, the fun thing about exalted weapons with this is that that is then coded as a unique status effect and a specific damage type for something like Arcane Impetus. Now, I'll make this clear first. If you stack cold with it, it doesn't count towards Archon Flow, but you notice Archon Flow is also on this build because if we go back to Exalted Blade, notice how I have gas and cold. Just simply having cold on this, which you can't do on an influence build, will in fact proc Archon Flow reliably, especially in this exact build where I'm running like Warcry and I'm running Exalted Blade drawn a decent amount of the time. Or I can choose to. That's really the design of it. So, how exactly are you able to knock down or fling enemies with Exalted Blade? So there's two very important things to understand. I'm going to start with Slash Dash. So Slash Dash, Exalted Blade is in fact what provides Slash Dash damage. If you subsume this off or this has 0 damage, then Slash Dash will do 0 damage, as well as any conditional bonuses that are increasing this, including like Precision Intensify, will in fact scale Slash Dash damage in that way because this doesn't have an innate damage value for a reason anymore. Now, Slash Dash, when you connect with a target, it not only applies a slash, but it'll also knock down the target if they're able to. And those do synergize the way you would expect, which is you don't just apply 1 slash proc, you apply 7, and that alone does a lot of damage. It does an insane amount in comparison to if you were running like an influence build where you not only don't get that arcane, you don't get arcane impetus because you can't proc it to the level that you can proc it on Afflictions. You can proc it to maybe 5 stacks on a Chromatic Blade influence build, but you can't proc it to 15. And then you also have to take up an extra mod slot in order to fit in Chromatic Blade because Afflictions really doesn't matter when it comes to Chromatic Blade. It really doesn't care. And then the other important things to note is that Chromatic Blade does not apply to Slash Dash. It applies to Exalted Blade, and when Exalted Blade is drawn, it'll therefore apply to Slash Dash, but it doesn't directly apply to Slash Dash. So that's where in an Afflictions build like this, I don't run Chromatic Blade. There's older variations I have where I run it with like just Blast, and with just Blast running Chromatic Blade works and it scales it, but it really isn't even necessary in my later testing. But it is a fun option, so if you want to keep running that build, if that's a build that you've seen before in my previous build video, then go for it and keep running it. But I would say this is going to be the like definitive guide for Afflictions in current patch, which is in November of 2025. So, getting back into Exalted Blade, I'll discuss some of the modding options here. So I've already discussed why Cold is on here, and you might wonder why Gas is on there. So Gas gets a little complicated because the way it scales is it really likes high base damage. It doesn't care as much for crit, it just really likes high base damage. And you don't want to be stacking it a crazy amount unless you can stack it with really high base damage. Unfortunately, Exalted Blade has really high base damage. It doesn't stack it all that often, but when you run a full combo build like this, if you have Exalted Blade actually drawn where you're able to make use of Blood Rush and Weeping Wounds, then you're over 100% status chance and you have a more than likely, it's like 66%, if I remember calculating it out, of proccing gas, 66% chance per attack, and that's pretty good. And then if you're flinging those enemies, because some of the other things that didn't Techrite Encore that is important to understand about the way Melee Afflictions works is this flung enemies. So how, if you're not slash dashing, how exactly can you proc this? Well, turns out the heavy attack waves that they added in Techrite Encore not only do a decent amount of damage, and even then don't scale off of combo counter right now. I don't know if that's intentional or a bug, but it's a bug report I have. But those waves will actually fling enemies, and they fling them through walls. So, in combination with the other benefits of Techrite Encore's rework, the waves actually proc combo, and because the waves proc combo, they also can proc Discipline's Merit and your Tennokai procs, and then you can spam heavy attacks, pretty much spam heavy attacks with full combo, getting all of his extra status to where you have these piercing waves that go through walls that are knocking down enemies, causing crazy gas clouds that hit in the millions, and all through walls. So keep that in mind. Going into the Exalted, or the actual Excalibur build, Bolt Augmented is on here because it's the second best arcane when it comes to stacking strength, and strength scales everything really well. Notice how Archon Flow is here. I described the purpose behind that. Archon Continuity is on here because if I'm using, most of the time I'm using Dual Liquor in my Toxin Magnetic build. If you're curious about that, I have a whole build video describing how to build that. Not specific to Excalibur, just probably the best Dual Liquor build in the game. All you have to do is hit an enemy once with a Toxin and then slash dash them, and now you have Corrosive as well. Or if you just happen to have those effects on the target. And then Archon Stretch, this is obviously a drop-in upgrade for Stretch in general. If you have the mod capacity, you might as well run it. But if you slash dash a target with electric on it and you can knock it down, you do in fact proc this. So there's no sense in not running it. The other thing about this build, and this gets into some of the flexibility with subsumes, you probably notice I have Warcry, Bright Bonnet, Roar, Nourish, and even Pool of Life and Well of Life, because this is actually viable and it's actually pretty good on Umbra as well. I've been running Warcry mostly, and there's part of the reasons for that. So I'll go back into the Exalted Blade build, and there's a variation of this that if you don't really care to ever pull out Exalted Blade, you just want to slash dash, you don't ever want to use Exalted Blade, you just want to maximize slash dash damage, this is what I recommend for that. So notice you don't have Blood Rush or Weeping Wounds because you can't benefit from Blood Rush and Weeping Wounds even on slash dash, even if your current melee weapon is at 12x220, which does buff slash dash damage, but it doesn't provide blood rush and weeping wound stacks for it. So then in this scenario, this is as just absolutely massive amount of damage as possible. So over 100% crit. You don't really care for status chance because slash dash does a pretty poor job at proccing status chance anyway, so there's no sense in having it. Even to the point where the extra 10% status damage and extra wind-up attack speed is actually more beneficial here than Galvanized mod. And then you notice a little bit of crit damage because this also gives you heavy attack wind-up speed, which is, if you do run this build because you don't really ever want to pull out Exalted Blade, but there's like a few percent of the time where you actually need to pull it out, or you want to pull it out, I highly recommend just spamming heavy attacks because those waves don't benefit from combo anyways, and their primary source of damage is going to be the fact that they can just stack all of this combo, or all of the status effects that are on a target. You can even do like what I've done sometimes. If you got teammates that stack a lot of status effects on targets, you pull out Exalted Blade, you heavy attack a few targets with a bunch of status effects on them, and then you're up to like 10, maybe 12 stacks, 13 stacks of Arcane Impetus sometimes. So this being that variant, I've been running this because the advantage here is that we can't really fit attack speed into this build, because if I were to fit attack speed, I would either be giving up a lot of crit, a lot of status chance, a lot of status damage. I would be unable to run this gas cold setup, or I'd have to sacrifice some crit chance and or melee damage. So there's really no place to fit it. But you don't need to fit it in the build to get attack speed, and that's where something like Warcry comes in. So Warcry. Warcry benefits a lot of things in this build. It doesn't benefit slash dash, and that's kind of the only thing it doesn't benefit. but I don't think it has to make it probably the best overall. Like, if you wanted the best quality of life Subsume on Excalibur, it's probably Warcry because of the way the Eternal War works, where you have one less buff you have to worry about. All you have to do is play the build, and you can stack this to the point where you pretty much can forget about it. So some of the things that Warcry does that are beneficial in this build. So the extra armor is actually useful here because Excalibur as a warframe is a pretty neutral when it comes to his base stats, like 370, 370, 315. Like overall, nothing really stellar, nothing really bad either. So you can kind of go either way. To the point where if you don't have Umbral polarities on him, you can even run Prime Vigor. Now, is Prime Vigor worth choosing over some of the other options for even an Excalibur main player like myself? No. Like, if you were coming up on 600 login day reward and you had the choice between Prime Vigor and like any of the other options, I would choose probably any of the other options. But if you're someone that has this mod, go for it. If you're someone who doesn't have this mod and you want to run a very similar build, and you're probably using what I recommend, which is just 2 Umbral polarities on Umbra specifically, then just run 2 of these. This is probably the only scenario I can think of where running 2 Umbral mods is actually beneficial because, yeah, you lose out on the extra strength from the third one, but there's really no nice way to fit that in there without running into problems. Now, you could, if you really wanted to, you can get rid of Eternal War, just recast this more often, or run it a little tighter and get rid of Archon Continuity because this effect really doesn't matter that much. Or you can even get rid of Blind Rage. So there's a few options around that. I run it like this because I am perpetually out of Umbral polarities because I polarize the heck out of even Prime and removing and re-adding Umbral polarities. But on Umbra, if you see my previous videos, more than likely you're running a setup like this with Archon Shards and you have max energy fill on spawn. So then if you wanted to run it like this, then go for it. And you don't have to really worry too much about mod capacity. In this case, it's actually really good, the mod capacity, but a lot of times you can run this tighter. And most of the time what I do is throw in like Furious Javelin into this Umbral slot, and it gets you close, like very close on running out, but you don't ever run out. So that's my recommendation for that. To not detract too much farther away from talking about afflictions. So we've covered over how you actually proc this. We've covered over what I think to be the best status types and mod configuration to proc this. We've covered the fact that you get an extra mod slot because you don't have to run chromatic, and you also get more flexibility because you get more strength this way. So then that leaves more room for better things because there's not a lot of very good arcanes in comparison to multi-augmented and arcane impetus if you're able to proc arcane impetus. And then some of the flexibility with if you need some more attack speed, Warcry is a really solid option for that. You can even just run extra on top of this armor, you get extra shield and health capacity if you want. You could even run Prime Redirection here if your build compensates for that in some way, like you're running a Sentinel. And then this kind of the other thing I kind of covered, but didn't cover in too deep. If you just want to run /dash, then your equipped melee matters a lot more. So you're able to effectively use 2 whole separate melee weapons simultaneously, and then have a good backup option if you're in a mission type or there's some sort of damage attenuation enemy and you just need a big old melee weapon. Okay, I'll cover some extra features that are beneficial to understand about melee afflictions with your pet. So Momentous Bond. The important thing to know here is that this is coded as ability damage status type in some way that allows it to maintain stacks of arcane impetus. And one of the features of something like Warcry is that it actually gives your companion attack speed. So then you're actually able to proc this and proc stat, or at least maintain your stacks using this a lot more effectively because your companion is also attacking faster. Same thing here when you run Warcry. Your tandem bond allows your melee of your companion to attack faster and therefore proc this combo bonus more. So you're more likely to be able to stack your combo. In the case of any Kavat, an important thing to note is that tandem bond doesn't scale off of any combo gain multipliers or whatever, But this will actually hit multiple enemies and proc multiple stacks of those sets. So you could have like 24 combo per hit just based on this. Or maybe even 30. It's hard to tell sometimes because it's so fast. So that's an important thing to understand. Just to cover over this, the only slight variation I've made from my previous video where I showed my Thrax Killer build for this is I found this to kind of be a little bit better overall. Yeah, it's something to keep in mind. So feel free to experiment as you see please. So I think lastly, what I'll just sort of show over real quick is just Archon Shards in case anyone's wondering. On Prime, the only variation is this max energy fill on spawn. If you're curious how this works, I would recommend checking out my video discussing how Umbra Sentience works, because this is very important for that, especially if you're pulling out Exalted Blade. Focus School, I usually just stick to this, but to not get too deeply into the build itself and detracting away from actual melee afflictions. We'll get into some gameplay and I'll show some interactions here and sort of prove some interactions for you.
Accept your death, and you may yet avoid it.
So some of the gameplay features I recommend, especially in this build. You'll notice my, well, before I got an energy orb, if you notice my energy, it was pretty low. So usually what I'll do is I'll pull out Exalted Blade and I'll get a few kills to the point where I get an energy orb from either my proc or from an enemy, so that I get a little bit more energy, because otherwise it's pretty tight right off the rip to be able to proc something like Warcry. So I'll show just Exalted Blade working. We'll let it stop doing its job. Alright, so I'll show an enemy here. Well, we'll show him... Eventually, we'll show one that's not dead. And notice how I already have 9 stacks of Impetus, because my companion is also proccing stacks. As long as we've got a Eximus killed, he will continue to stack every single combination of elements eventually. And all he's got to do is do that a couple of times and you heavy attack wave through it and just watch those stacks go up. So I'm already at 10. As easy as that. You probably saw there, the Eximus was actually able to have his entire overguard stripped just from the area of effect of gas on the target that I hit next to him. So, in comparison to something like Blast, this does a better job at not just killing all your enemies instantly as well, because it does stop scaling after some time, like level 500 or so, it stops scaling that well. But just something to keep in mind. It's one of the features of gas where it has that extra tick that's required for it to actually do some damage, and that can matter a lot when it comes to your energy economy, to your ability to maintain combo, everything. So notice I was very, very easy to use. I'm not recasting abilities here. I'm not having to. I haven't even used Furious Javelin yet. Look at some numbers with some Furious Javelin stacks. 800 stacks. Because our strength is pretty high here. And I'm actually almost at full stacks. And we'll look to see... I snapshotted this pretty early on, my Warcry. And we're 88% recast. What are we at now? We're at 109%. So that's how much more strength we get with this build. You notice sometimes... That's not always my companion, by the way. You see all those blue status effects? That's not always my companion. Some of the times that's actually Afflictions proccing. And I know this because of the circuit. So feel free to pause at any point, look at number values. Sometimes these are hard for me to see while I'm actually just playing. So I think a pretty good demonstration of, you give it enough attack speed with something like Warcry, you're buffing your teammate. All your teammates, you're buffing your companion if you're using not a Sentinel, I guess. If you're using a beast type that has melee attacks. And you're getting plenty of Tennokai procs. Those Tennokai procs do decent damage, but largely it's when they proc status effect where they do an absurd amount. Assuming my companion doesn't kill it before I'm able to show that. I don't think he actually got knocked down from that. Or stacked from that. So something to note too, this might come up as a question. You can run this build entirely fine on Umbra. Just keep in mind, if you're coming in and out of Operator a lot, you probably don't want to run Warrior's Rest with something like Warcry, which is why I showed it in that build. Doesn't mean you can't run Bazarin like I have, because that increased affinity radius does actually buff the range of Warcry. Is that necessary? Probably not, but if you don't want to run Bazarin for it, just run Unaru with Warrior's Rest, and then you're popping in and out of Operator here and there anyways. You know, if you want to proc your Astral Bond here, that's a pretty good example of that. I haven't even really been using the peak of this build, which is using something like Warrior or Furious Javelin. I didn't even get the heavy attack in before he died. Just in case someone's wondering, like, why Prime Vigor is actually, I've come to prefer it, is because I run Bazarin, you get that shield, the shield buff from your #1 ability. And I found that to work actually really good with just a little bit of extra shields. I've done a lot of testing between this and Archon Vitality. Entirely viable to use. You could run Adaptation as well there. You could run Rolling Guard in there. It really doesn't matter. It's sort of just your defensive slot. If you do have my recommended 2 Umbral polarities, though, I think just the 2 Umbral mods works just fine. You're getting your armor, not from the mod, but from Warcry. So, my recommendation there. So I think best thing to do at this point is to recap. So I'll recap some of these features in case any of those were missed. So Melee Afflictions. Knockdown or Fling can be done with, you can proc Melee Afflictions with Slash and Exalted Blade. There's an easy way to fix some of the modding limitations on Exalted Blade, being that you can just outsource your attack speed to something like Arcane Strike or Warcry would be my recommendation, which also has a plethora of other features. You're able to maintain your energy with just this being on there and getting enough kills, and then also stacking some level of energy orb effectiveness, which these are really good. These are sleeper if you haven't tried these out yet. And because we're running Afflictions, we're able to stack Arcane Impetus, proccing Archon Flow, proccing other Archon mods. It frees up a mod slot because we don't need Chromatic Blade in order to make the build like somewhat functional. Giving a lot of flexibility. But it's the #1 way I found to buff Slash Dash other than Furious Javelin itself. And then also making Exalted Blade's heavy attack waves actually do damage, because otherwise they really don't do that much damage unless they're able to stack a bunch of status effects. Yeah, so if there's any questions about that, if there's anything you think I left out, any overall suggestions for it, I'd say this has been pretty well min-maxed into the ground when it comes to the amount of different things that I've tested, but I'm not perfect. So if you've thought of something and I haven't tried it yet, feel free to leave it in the comments below. And thanks for watching.